we're now going to take a little step back. Mark foreshadowed it a bit there, to the end of the last ice age around 12,000 years ago. Our guide through the Holocene as we know it will be Hannah Sellers, a researcher who specialises in environmental change in woodlands in the Leicestershire landscape. So without further ado, Hannah, would you like to come up and take us over the next 12,000 years?
Thank you very much. So let's continue on our journey. And like Rachel said, I'm just going to take you through the recent history of Leicester, only the last 12,000 years. So before I carry on this journey, let me just go over a few abbreviations that you might see in my dates. So we have currently thinking about today's date, we're in 2023. So in this time frame we use CE for Common Era, which you might also know as AD. And then as we go back through time, we go through BCE, before Common Era, so which is similar to BC, if you've heard of that. But with those in mind, let's think about going forward. So we're coming out of the last ice age, and yes, before you ask, woolly mammoths did roam Leicestershire. But as we come into the Holocene, which started around 9,700 BCE, let's see actually how our environment changed. But before that, how can we look at what environments were like thousands of years ago? So we can use a range of different data, which you might have seen from the table displays before. We had paleoecology, so it's looking at fossil pollen. We can look at archaeological records, see how humans interacted with their environment, and also historical records, so we can look at place names and other historical maps to try and reconstruct what the past environment was like. Now, for my research, I use a range of different sites, but one key site is Narborough Bog in Leicestershire. Now, this is southwest Leicester. This is a wildlife trust site owned by Wildlife Trust, but it's a peat bog with wet woodland and wet meadow. Now, we called this, you can see by the pictures, about October 2021, and we got our dates back last month, and in this core, the lowest part of my core goes back to 9,000 BCE. So this covers the majority of the Holocene, making it one of the longest records of environmental change, all within a core that is 1.5 metres long. So if we look at that in pollen, this is what a pollen diagram looks like, so we can look at different trees, different herbs, plants, grasses. But this is a bit complicated to look at, so let me talk you through it. So, first off, as we go into the Holocene, we have the Stone Age. So in the Middle Stone Age, as we're coming out of the Ice Age, it's quite an open landscape, which is then colonised by trees. So first, pine and birch come and create these woodlands, followed by other more well-known species, thinking about our oaks, ashes, elms, limes, and this makes what we know as a Celtic broadleaf forest. So these were quite natural across England. But as we go through the Late Stone Age, as Mark hinted, settlers start to arrive. So this starts to clear the land a bit more, thinking about cultivation and pasture. As we continue through time, we then go into the Bronze Age. Now here, the woodlands start to change a bit. There's a decline in sort of oak, ash, lime, and this leads to quite dominated woodland by elder and hazel. Now here also, as you might see on the right, thinking about increase in humans. So between the Bronze Age and Iron Age, there's an increase in the amount of agriculture, but also the exploitation of wood. Because these species like oak and ash, they tend to be used for charcoal, so this is a key fuel in this time. And also metal tools come around, and which leads to more efficient clearing of these areas. As we come into the Romans, we are in quite an open environment with just patches of woodland around. And with Romans, even more species come out in terms of the crops they bring, from lentils, garlic, onions, even turnips. And so the use of sort of agriculture grows even more. As we go into medieval times, this is when more historical records start to show. So in the Domesday in 1086, Leicestershire is one of the least wooded counties in the country. And with these medieval records, there's also things that I can start to use in my research. This is where place names come in. Now, place names, they're everywhere. But actually thinking about the origin of them, you can think about where they start, how it changes through time, but also the place name themselves. So with place names, we start to mix and match with sort of Old English name elements, which come from Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian origins. For example, I have Ashby up here. At the beginning we have Ashk, which is ash, and by, which is village. Put together, you have village where ash trees grow. So part of my research is looking at these place names and actually, does this tell us actually what was in the environment at the time? So for example, if you think back to Narborough, these are a list of species found in Narborough Parish place names. And if we bring back the pollen, you actually start to see there are some similarities from oak, willow, alder, elm and hazel. These start to show, so part of my research is looking actually, is this pattern, can it actually tell us about past environment? And just for one example, we have oak, so a place name is Copt Oak, which if you try to translate that, that means pollarded oak, which is a certain management of a tree. So here you can see the upper branches are basically cut to promote growth. And interestingly, when this place name starts to come in, it's actually where we start to see this peak in sort of the oak pollen. So we're starting to look at maybe some similarities, but I'm still during my PhD, so you have to wait for a bit longer to see if this is conclusive. So now we carry on as we go into the early and late modern, and again, woodlands are very much exploited, particularly for timber production through maybe sort of ships, but also particularly in the World Wars, when a lot of the broadleaf woodlands that still survived actually start to be cut down for wood for the wars. But then it's not just the cutting down of them, it's actually how they're replaced. So obviously, timber production is really important. So they start to plant these quick-growing sort of non-native species, even to these sort of conifer plantations, which is less species-rich than our natural woodlands. So in comparison of the recovery of them, it's not quite the same. But now we come to the present day. So on the left, I have a map of the tree cover. As you can probably tell by the green, it's a little patchy. Now with Leicestershire, about 4% of the land use is woodlands. Less than 1% is actually ancient woodlands, and even these aren't totally untouched. So we're now in what we call the Anthropocene, which is the new geological epoch, which is about the age of humans. So it's when humans have been having a drastic impact on the environment, which you probably know through like the climate crisis, biodiversity crisis. But it's also the time where we can start to think about how we can act. So we can think about how we conserve what we have and sort of enable for the future. So we have Cloudborough, for example, which you might have seen from some of the table displays. Actually thinking about this because it was clear-felled in the 1960s through, and Bethany's work is looking at this, and it's actually been left to naturally regenerate. And over the 60 years, it's become quite a biodiverse woodland, so recovery is possible. So now's the time to think about how we can conserve what we have left, protect it from threats like invasive species, and look towards the future to enable these biodiverse and resilient woodlands in Leicestershire for the future.